Gladys attended a church service one particular Sunday. The sermon seemed to go on forever, and many of the congregation fell asleep. After the service, to be social, she walked up to a sleepy gentleman, and in an attempt to revive him from his stupor, she extended a hand and said, "Hello, I'm glad he's done." To which he replied, "So am I." So this is the second week of a new series, ostensibly about Luke's Gospel. My talk is found in 3 of the Gospels. Unfortunately, not in Luke's. The story we're going to consider today is found in Matthew chapter 14, Mark chapter 6, and John chapter 6. But I'm going to read from Matthew's Gospel, but I will refer to the others because they all bring something into the story that's not in one individual account. So I've entitled this talk, Who Dares Wins. Who Dares Wins. So Matthew 14. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountaintop by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and said, "It is a ghost," and cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, that is Jesus, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the sea and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So I've got 4 points. Jesus sends them into a storm. Jesus is in control. Jesus, a very present help in time of trouble. And 4, Jesus responds to faith. So to set the scene, Jesus had just fed 5,000 plus people with a little boy's lunch. And as soon as the fragments had been gathered, the Bible says he made them get into the boat. Jesus made them get into the boat. Now the verb there is something called anakazo, but it means to force, to compel, to urge. He had to badger them to get into the boat. That's a private joke I'll explain later. So that was not a suggestion. It wasn't, "If you like, chaps, just get into the boat and I'll see you later on." It was more like, "Get into the boat. Get into the boat." So why did he want the disciples to go ahead of him? Well, there's several reasons it could be. It could be that he wanted to pray alone. He often did that. It could be he wanted just to escape the crowd and to have some rest. But I think the main reason why he wanted to do it is found in John's Gospel. And it says this, "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." He didn't want his disciples to be influenced by the crowd that wanted to take him and make him an earthly king. Jesus' kingdom wasn't at that time. And so he wanted to prevent his disciples from being swamped in that. So, night had come. The disciples were now 3 or 4 miles away from shore, and there's a strong wind. If they'd started rowing just after the finishing of the feeding the 5,000 and collecting all the fragments up into 12 baskets, they would have been rowing for most of the night. It says that he came to them in the 3rd or the fourth watch of the night. The fourth watch of the night is between 3 in the morning and 6 in the morning. Now Mark portrays them as straining at the oars, trying to make headway against the wind. The word there is basanidzo, and it means, it's actually the word used for torture. So this wasn't an easy row, this was a torturous event. So they're being battered by the winds, there's a rising sea, and in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus comes to them, but they see him as an apparition. So the first thing we need to notice, is Jesus sometimes puts us in difficult places. He was sending them into a storm, but he doesn't do this because he doesn't love us. He does this for the very opposite, because he loves us, because he knows it's in the times that we have storms in our life that is when we turn to him. Probably because we've come to an end of ourselves. We've come to an end of our reliance upon material things, and we've come to an end of relying upon ourselves. There is only one person can help us in this event. He wants us to discover him in a new way. He wants us to see his faithfulness, his love. Jesus sends them into a storm, but he doesn't send them into danger. And that seems a little bit contradictory, saying, well, hang about, they're being beaten by the waves and the winds. They've been rowing for most of the night and they're not making headway at all. How can they possibly not be in danger? And that's my second point. Because Jesus is in full control. And let me prove that to you. He wasn't taken off guard by the crowd wanting to take him by force to make him king. He knew that. Before they even attempted it, he knew what they were trying to do, and he got his disciples out of the way. He wasn't taken off guard by that. He was in total control. He was able to make 5,000 plus men do what he wanted. They wanted to make him king. He says, I'm having none of it. Go away. That took some doing. If you've got a crowd whipped up wanting to do something, it is very difficult to make them people stop what they're doing. He managed it. We're not told how, but he managed it. He looked out for the disciples' physical safety. In Mark 6 it says, and he saw that they were making headway painfully. In verses 13 to 21, we see him as Lord of nature, multiplying a few loaves and a few fishes and making them to feed at least 10,000 people. He was able to uphold Peter when he was sinking, even though the winds and the waves were lashing about. He is Lord of time and space. Again in John's Gospel it says this, they'd rowed 3 or 4 miles. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. They transversed the last couple of miles instantaneously. Jesus was in full control. Thirdly, Jesus was a very present help in time of trouble. The disciples were unaware that he knew about their difficulties. They didn't know that he was making his way to them. There is no mention of them in the passage praying to God, saying, help us. There's no mention of that. They did in Matthew 8 and the other storm event. They came to Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing? Lord, save us. And he did. Possibly they didn't pray because Jesus wasn't physically with him. Out of sight, out of mind. He wasn't there. They were caught up in the moment. There's have you ever watched a program called Father Ted? Yeah? And in that program, Father Ted, there's one of the episodes, they're on a plane, and Dougal has gone into the cockpit and he's pressed a button and he's dumped all the fuel. And they don't have enough fuel to actually land the plane. And they only have 2 parachutes. And there's about 20 or 30 Catholic ministers on the plane. And so they decide what they will do is write down and give a little talk about why you deserve to have the parachute. And so they all start to pipe up. Should I include this? Yes, all right. Should I include that? No, don't include that. Blah, blah, blah. And then one of them stands up and says, rather timidly, do you think we might pray? And all the Catholic priests go, oh, no. And that's just us. Shall we pray? It's the last thing on our mind. In Mark's Gospel, it says they were making headway painfully. But he knew that. He was watching. He was looking. He was looking out for them. Not only was he watching, but he came to them. In the 4th hour of the night, he came to them walking on the sea without them asking him to pray. He came to them, but they didn't recognize his intervention. They were filled with fear. When we need Jesus most of all, very often our fear will cloud our spiritual judgment. The disciples literally screamed with fear. They didn't scream to God, help us. They were terrified. As soon as Jesus hears the cry, he talks to them. You're safe. It is I. Don't be afraid. The word he uses for it is I is ego eimi. It means I am. And it would be difficult not for the disciples, when you've seen somebody walking on the water and you've seen other miracles to do, for somebody to say I am. They would realize in the Jewish context that he was declaring that he was God. He was Lord over all. So how can we apply that? Jesus responds instantly to our distresses. But sometimes it takes time for that to work through. We are under his watch. We are under his control. He sees, he knows, he cares. The Lord wants us to triumph in difficult situations, and sometimes that involves taking risks. I must have told you this before. One of my favourite verses is Hebrews 13 verse 5, and it says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Simple verse. What you won't know unless you know Greek is there is actually 5 negations in that sentence. Ume. Right, if you want to say no in Greek, you can say u. If you want to say no in Greek, you can say me. If you put them together, you get no or never never. Now in English, if we put 2 negations together, they cancel each other out. So if I was to say, I am not going to the shops, that would mean I'm going to the shops. But it's not so in Greek. When they do it in Greek, it reinforces what is being said. So what he's saying is, I will never. That means exactly what it says. I'll never. Though heaven and earth pass away, I will never leave you. I will always be there. I will never forsake you. Spurgeon said this in a sermon, funnily enough, entitled Never, No Never, Never Never. 5 negations. In our English language, 2 negatives would destroy each other, but it is not so in the Greek language. And the heaping up of it, as it were, of these denials on God's part of all thought of ever forsaking his people ought to be sufficient to satisfy even the most doubtful among us. If God has said, I will not, no, never forsake my people, we must believe him, and we must chase away all thoughts of possibility of the Lord forsaking his servants or leaving them to perish. We are not out of sight and out of mind. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Jesus responds to faith. Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water. Now reading this, it sounds like Peter's got a little bit of doubt. It's actually what's called a first-class conditional sentence. And a first-class conditional sentence is one where the first part is an assumption that what you're saying is true. So you could read it like this. If it is you, and it is, command me to come to you on the water. That's what it means. If he had any doubt, he would never have left the boat. He'd been with Jesus. He knew his master's voice. My sheep hear my voice, and I know they follow me. Knowing that the Lord intellectually is in control is vastly different than experiencing he's in control. So, to Peter then, if Jesus was close by, why didn't he wait? He's going to come anyway. Why get out of the boat? Why put yourself in danger? Why get out of the boat? And the reason is, I think Peter not only wanted to be with the Lord, he wanted to walk on water. Now, I don't think there was something like this on Peter's mind. That'll look good on my CV under interests, walking on water. I don't think that entered his mind at all. He doesn't ask for something that's overtly spiritual. He could have said, make me God's man of power for the hour. Couldn't he? He doesn't ask for that. He doesn't say, like the other disciples, when you get to heaven, can I sit on your right hand? And the other one, can I sit on your left? He doesn't ask for that. He doesn't say, like Paul, that I might know him and the power of his resurrection, being made conformable unto his death. He doesn't ask for any of those things. He wants to walk on water. That's all he wants to do. Carpum Deum, seize the day. Now, what Peter did may have been impulsive. The opportunity was presented to him, but it wasn't presumptuous. He didn't stick his foot out on and launch himself into the sea. The Lord's going to save me. He asked permission. If it's you, bid me come. Come. After he's given permission, he can come. Now he has a choice. I wanted to do it. You've given me permission. Shall I stay in the boat where it's comparatively safe, or shall I take a risk and step out of the boat? If he'd stayed in the boat, would Jesus have still loved him? Would he have still done miracles for him? Yeah, of course he would. And we can see that in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel says, as soon as Jesus entered the boat, they are there immediately on the other side of the lake. A miracle. A miracle. Who was in the boat with him? The other disciples. None of them had decided, I'm going to step out of the boat, but yet Jesus did a miracle for them. Jesus still wanted to be with them. He still wanted to serve them. He still wanted to bless them. But by stepping out of the boat, he was able to experience God in a deeper way. He was able to say from experience, now unto him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above that which I can ask or think. It was no longer theoretical. He'd proved it. He'd done it. You can't be a theoretical overcomer. You're either an overcomer or you're dreaming about it. Now let's look at Peter's role in this. Having been asked to give permission, asked permission to come out of the boat, he had to make a physical response. It doesn't say in the Bible that his legs went like this to get out of the boat. He had to make a choice. He had to put his foot over, 1, 2, and start to walk. Now, if it had been me, I don't know about you, I'd have been like this. Or, if it had been working, there was an apprentice there, it would have been. Yeah, we can go. Consider the circumstances of the walk. Jesus didn't make it easy for him. The wind was still howling, the waves were still there, and he walked. For some reason, I don't know what it is, but we expect when we step out in doing something for God that the way is going to be easy. How many people have experienced that? Very few, I would think. But somewhere on the journey, he gets afraid. He sees the wind. He was a fisherman. He'd always seen the wind. He's seen the waves. He was a good swimmer. In John chapter 21, it tells us he swam about 100 yards with his clothes on. He was a strong swimmer. The idea of walking on water seemed great at the time, but when he put his foot down on the water and started to see the effects of the wind and the waves, that's a different matter. When we start out doing things for God in a new venture, we're full of expectation and optimism. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's great possibilities of where God's going to work. We've counted the cost. We've looked at the problems. We know what the possibilities are. But we haven't faced any of them yet. He was afraid and he began to sink. That's what the Bible said. Now, how many of you have stepped out of the baths onto the water? Do you sink or do you begin to sink? You sink, don't you? Natural law, it's an analog thing. You step off, you're down. Yeah? It's not a digital thing. Is it? You sink. Now, we know that he didn't sink instantaneously because he had time to say, Master, save me. Now, if he had sunk, the Bible wouldn't record that. What it would record would be as he went down. The signs, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholds him in with his hand. Instantly, Jesus grabs him by the hand and says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now, I've never read this and thought, you useless individual, couldn't you even do one step on the water with that? It's not that sort of tone. Not that at all. It's, if only you hadn't doubted, you could have walked with me. We could have surfed on the waves together. We could have done other things. But they make their way back to the boat. If you read the text, Jesus doesn't make it easy. The wind is still there. The waves are still roaring. It is not until they get to the boat that it ceases and they're at the shore. So he proved to him, I can hold you through the storms of life. This external thing is not going to harm you. What you've got to ask yourself is, who was safer? The disciples in the boat or Peter holding the hand of Jesus? So what can we learn? Only good can come from stepping out with God. Peter learned that God was able to do anything. With God's, all things are possible. God's calling is God's enabling. He walked on water. Nobody else has done that. He walked on water. Even though he failed, he walked on water. We don't know how far he went, but we know he must have walked far enough for Jesus to grab him by the hand. So he got almost all the way, but not fully. When we're fully trusting in God, we are fully secure. And finally, all things work together to good for those that love God and are called according to his purpose. When he began to sink, when he'd failed God, God still loved him. He prevented him from being submerged. He learned God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. He knew the gentle rebuke of the Lord. God only rebukes those that belong to him. It was care. Why doubt? But the people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So we are going to pray for people, and Jane's going to come and do that in a minute. But for a moment, I just want you to close your eyes. Now, don't be shocked, but I want you to imagine that you've died and that you're a spectator at your own memorial service held here. So the coffin's at the front, and everybody in here is somebody that knows you. And a representative of each of those is going to come up and say something about you. Now forget that this might not already be into your life, but here are some examples of what you might want them to say. He was the best footballer this country has ever seen. She was a true friend. She was the best father, mother, brother, sister anybody could wish for. He was a great pastor, used mightily in prophecy, an exceptional teacher, an outstanding evangelist. She was used in miracles, gifts of healing, helps governments, blah, 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 blah. The things that you want people to say about you are the things that are important to you. So what I want you to do is, I want you to pick something that's important to you. And I want you to ask God to put that into your life. And then after the meeting, I want you to step out of the boat and tell somebody what that is and get them to pray into it. Jane.